Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I'd like to thank the Tasmanian branch of the Economic Society, the University of Tasmania, and the Academy of the Social Sciences for making this lecture possible. And also, I would like to thank all of you very much for taking time off very busy schedules to come here and listen to this talk. So thank you very much for being here tonight. I am very pleased to be giving this lecture. I never got to meet Gale, unfortunately, but I have read a lot of her works, and what comes through is a person of great intellect, integrity, and compassion, and I am indeed very honored to be giving a lecture in her honor here tonight. In choosing the topic for this talk, I thought of Faye's efforts in promoting Aboriginal rights and women's rights and her concern for equity and justice, and I thought that looking at recent developments in income inequality would be very appropriate. And so tonight, my goal is to give you a brief overview of recent developments in income inequality in Australia. And I want to add that I have pitched a lecture for non-economists, so you'll be pleased about that as well. Okay, first I think we need to ask basic question, why do we care about inequality? In fact, it's a bit out of fashion for economists to be speaking about equity, which is really a shame because, of course, equity is very closely tied to justice and ethics, and we need to be reminded of this. Individuals care about their own well-being, but they also care about the level of inequality in their society, and the redistribution of income is a major role of governments. A few months ago, it was interesting to see the results of a survey of Australians asking them whether they thought that the level of inequality in the Australian society was appropriate or too high or too low. And a majority of Australians said that they thought the level of inequality was much too high in Australia. And then when asked their perception about the level of inequality, it turns out that they were underestimating quite a lot the current level of inequality in the society. So individuals do care a lot about this. Inequality, although a different concept, is closely related to poverty and all the associated social problems that come with poverty. So you think of crime rates, health problems, mental health, physical health problems, all of those issues accompany inequality as well as poverty. Many economists would believe that there is a trade-off between equity and efficiency, and so some level of inequality is needed to keep growth at an acceptable rate. And so here you have theories about the need to compensate individuals for risk-taking, for providing greater effort, for skilling, for greater abilities, and so that creates inequality by itself. But we often forget that inequality may reflect inefficiencies as well, such as discrimination and labor market imperfections. And also, inequality may cause societal and economic problems. So there are models and theories that economists work with that show that very polarized societies can lead to alienation between groups and the occurrence of inefficient equilibria in the economy. So inequality may actually lead to inefficiencies as well. How do we measure inequality? There are many different measures that are used, but the most popular measure is the Gini Index. The Gini Index averages the shares of income across the distribution, placing more weight on the people at the bottom of the distribution. If you deal with positive incomes, the Gini Index lies between 0 and 1. The higher it is, the more inequality you have. For a country like Australia, the Gini Index usually lies between 0.3 and 0.4. Some things which are not usually pointed out and realized by people is that even small movements in a measure like the Gini mean large transfers of income in the society. So here I'm giving you an example. Suppose the Gini increases by 0.035, and that's not a randomly chosen number. You'll see the number in a minute. But if the Gini were to increase by 0.035, that would be equivalent to the transfer of 7% of the overall average income from people in the bottom half to people in the top half of the income distribution. So a large transfer. And of course, for people in the bottom half, this is worth a lot more than 7% of their incomes, because their incomes are below the average, and it's worth less than 7% for people who are getting this transfer at the top. So even small movements mean large transfers of income in the economy. So here I'm showing you the Gini Index for incomes in Australia over the period, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s up to 2007. As you can see, there's a period of growth in inequality in the 80s, and that was experienced by a lot of countries, developed economies. There's a period of stabilization over the 90s in inequality, and then there's a jump up in the 2000s in the Gini. And this change is 0.035. So from 2003 to 2007, the Gini increased by 0.035. So a sharp turn in the 2000s. If I were to extend this in the earlier periods, it's difficult given availability of data for Australia, but based on what's happening in earnings, what you would see is a period of stability in inequality over the 60s and 70s. Some years you would even see a small decline in inequality, and then a U-turn happened in the early 80s in earnings as well as income, and that continued up till the 90s, stable period here, and then sharp increase in the 2000s. And so my goal now is to talk about the factors that have contributed to these trends in inequality. But before that, a few things. So first of all, comparison with other OECD countries. A large report on income inequality was conducted by the OECD. It was published in 2008. So this looked at trends in income inequality for OECD countries, including Australia. An interesting fact was in this report, the data for Australia covered the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, so that period of stability in inequality. Whereas for most other OECD countries, the data covered the period starting in the mid-80s. And that's because of data problems in Australia. So you did not see the increase in the 80s, you just saw the period of stability over the 90s. So Australia looks great in this report, looks fantastic. The level of inequality in Australia was in fact lower than the OECD average in the mid-2000s, and the trend was better in the sense that there was no increase. Depending on the measure used, there was even a slight decline in Australia compared to the other OECD countries over this period. Numbers that I have computed show that the trend over the 80s in Australia was in fact similar to the OECD average. But you have to make very brave assumptions to carry the numbers over the 80s. And I'll talk a bit more about that. But there are large data problems in Australia in looking at distributions of income. So in the last period, the position has deteriorated from 2003 to 2007. Australia's rank in 30 OECD countries fell from 15 to 24 in terms of equality. So a change in Australia in the 2000s and a change relative to other OECD countries in the 2000s. Okay, those of you who have worked with this, with income, are probably wondering what level of income, what measure of income I'm using. So I'll just say a few things here. The numbers that I showed you in that trend, this line, were for pre-tax income, annual income. It was at the income unit level of observation for Australia. A lot of researchers in the area would say that it is more appropriate to use post-tax income as the tax system is redistributing income, so post-tax income would be more closely related to purchasing power, therefore more closely related to well-being. So here I show you that whether you use pre-tax income or post-tax income, you get similar trends over time. The other important decision here has to do with what unit of observation you use. I have been using the income unit. An income unit is an adult plus a partner, if there is a partner, plus any dependent children. A lot of researchers in this area would be using households, which would also include all other individuals living in the same residence. So inequality when you use households is less because you have more people sharing the same resources. I will, for all the numbers for the rest of the talk, I will use post-tax income and the income unit level because of some of the calculations that I am doing. And so I will be using this definition of income. But you can see that the trends are very similar. A few other data issues. In Australia, virtually all studies on poverty, trends in poverty and trends in inequality are based on two surveys, the Household Expenditure Survey and the Survey of Income and Housing Costs. And the reason for this is that other representative surveys will give you income in categories rather than levels, than numbers. And when you look at inequality, it's important to have income numbers rather than income categories. And so we are limited to these two surveys. All the numbers I will show you for Australia are based on the Survey of Income and Housing Costs. Unfortunately, these surveys experience major changes over time, and since we have no other surveys that we can use to bridge these changes, we have to make assumptions and recalculations of inequality in order to get comparative series over time. So I have had to do that, but I will not give you all the details of that. The one thing, though, I will say is the last survey that I had that was available when I wrote the lecture, that was the survey conducted in 2008, 2009. This survey did include major changes, but for this year, the ABS provided additional income figures, and so this allowed comparisons with previous years. Now, since I first gave this talk, as these things go, a new survey has become available. And so I have done a few rough calculations with the most recent survey, and I'll say a few words on that. Although the numbers are not incorporated in the lecture, I will add a few numbers orally. So I do want to add that if you look at the most recent survey, so the survey would cover annual income 08, 09, so post-GFC a bit. If you computed the Gini, there is a drop in the Gini, but a very small drop following the GFC. So it would be lying around this point here. So you can see a change there happening because of the GFC, but still, these levels of inequality are much higher than the levels we were seeing in the 90s. Okay, a few other comments on measures. So there's a lot of work being done in this area in terms of extending or expanding the type of measures that we use to look at inequality so that the measures better reflect well-being and not just income. There's a lot of work being done on using multidimensional indices rather than just income. Most of you will be aware of Sen's work on this and Sen's use of capabilities rather than just income to measure well-being. There's other work looking at other dimensions. So here I'm looking at annual income, but in fact people smooth income over longer periods than 1 year. And so some people use longer periods of income, so income more closely tied to a permanent measure of income to look at inequality. The other issue which is important here is if you look at different parts of the distribution, you may want to use something else than income. So people who look at poverty prefer using consumption rather than income. If you look at the fluctuations in income for people at the bottom of the distribution, the fluctuations in income are much larger than fluctuations in consumption. So people manage to smooth fluctuations in their income, even the people at the bottom of the distribution. So either they make use of broader family networks, or they delay replacements of durable, but they do have ways of smoothing fluctuations in income. And so for people who study poverty, it makes sense to look at consumption rather than income. For people who look at the top of the distribution, because wealth is so different from income, it makes more sense to use wealth, because that's a closer measure to well-being. In Australia, we're very limited in terms of the data we have access to look at wealth. So most people look at income. Since I'm looking at the whole distribution, it's appropriate for me to look at income rather than other measures. Okay, one last point on this. The Gini is a strict measure of inequality. So if you take an economy, you double everybody's income, the Gini does not change. It is just looking at the shape of the distribution, not the level. Now, people care about their level of income as well as the dispersion of income in the society. So a broader measure of well-being would include both level of income and level of inequality in the society. And some people are working on such measures. So here I give you an example from Sen. He defines social well-being as the mean income times the level of equality in the society. And let me show you what that would look like for Australia over this period. So the red line is this measure of well-being, the mean times level of equality. The blue line is the Gini that I was showing you before. So over the 90s, inequality was fairly stable, but well-being, measured in this way, was going up very rapidly because the level of income was increasing very rapidly over this period. Over the later period, in the 2000s, you had an increase in inequality, but the average income was increasing so much over this period that the overall well-being increased, despite the increase in inequality. So that's a particular example of how to measure well-being, taking into account both levels of income as well as dispersion in incomes. There is even less consensus on how to measure well-being than there is on how to measure inequality. And so what most people do is to present separately increases in averages of income and changes in inequality in income. And that is what I will do as well for the rest of the talk. So let me show you changes in income over this period. So for now, forget about the red bit, just look at the blue bit. And the blue bit shows you average annual growth rates in incomes over the period of the 90s. And so what you see is the mean was growing a bit more rapidly than the median. The bottom was growing quite healthily over this period. This is the bottom 20%, bottom quintile. The middle 60% was growing very slowly, so this is the disappearing middle that we've heard about over this period. The top was growing at a healthy rate over this period as well. The mean was growing faster than the median, reflecting the high growth at the top, high growth rate at the top. The median reflects really the middle. Now look at the bits in red. So this is now the period in the 2000s, a very different picture. So one very worrying thing is that the bottom 20% was suffering declines in their average income over this period. The middle was doing much better, and the top is doing very well indeed over this period. Okay? So quite a different picture over the two periods if you look at increases in average incomes. Okay, if I look at comparisons of growth rates in income with OECD, in the early period, growth rates are similar in Australia to the average for the OECD countries. Australia did really look good over this period. The bottom 20% was growing faster than the average OECD countries, and the top 20% was growing more slowly than the average for the OECD countries. Okay? So Australia did really look very good. In the later period, I could not get detailed information for the OECD, but I got a few numbers here and there. And what you see is that the growth rates are higher in Australia than the average for the OECD countries. This is, of course, going to even become more extreme now, I would think. And the growth for the top group is, so the increases are faster in Australia for the top group than the average OECD country over this period. So again, a very different picture over the 90s and over the 2000s. Okay, when people look at causes of inequality growth and inequality trends over time, traditionally people looked at 4 factors. And now we've had to add a 5th factor, which is what is happening at the top of the distribution, because the big changes are happening there at the top of the income distribution. So traditionally people would look at demographic changes, trends in the labor market, any changes in government redistributive policies, and other sources of income. So I will quickly walk you through these factors, show you what's happening in Australia. So first, demographic changes. So here people look at the aging of the population and changes in household structure. And this is believed to be driven by increasing life expectancy, reduction in fertility rates, increasing age at marriage, and increasing divorce rates is the other one. Those are the main factors that explain these changes. The aging of the population is theoretically would have an ambiguous effect, because what you expect to see is the population share of the young falling, population share of the old is rising. Both of these groups are associated with low incomes, and so they counteract each other in the overall trend in inequality. Changes in the household structure is believed to push up inequality. So basically you have decreases in the share of 2-parent households and increases in the share of other types of households, so smaller households. So fewer people to share the resources, so increases in inequality. So here I'm showing you some numbers for Australia in the population shares to look at the aging of the population. So if you look in 95, the share of the young was 38%. By 2005, it was 35%, so a decline. The share of the old is increasing, but these are very gradual. These gradual trends will not explain the shifts in the Gini that I was showing you in that graph. Okay? These changes will show up in long-term trends only, not in those sharp turnarounds in the Gini. If I look at changes in fertility, this is the number of children per woman in Australia, 85 compared to 2003. You can see that there is a decline in the number of children per woman over this period in Australia, but you see this decline all throughout the distribution. So it will push up inequality, but it is working all throughout the distribution, so it doesn't push up inequality as much as you would think. There was a study by the ABS done for the period of 95 to 2003 using shift share type of analysis to look at the effects of demographic changes on overall inequality in income, and the results suggested that the demographic changes in fact reduced the Gini by less than 0.005, so very small effects. So again, these changes are very gradual over time. Now, this does not take into account any kind of political economy story, and there hasn't been a lot of work on this, but if you think of a very powerful gerontocracy in your society, that could influence the type of policies that are implemented by the government. And so all these numbers do not take those factors into account, and there hasn't been a lot of work on that. The capital income. So in fact, capital income is a mixture of all sorts of different income. different incomes. And so you have people at the bottom of the distribution earning capital income, think superannuation, and then you have people at the top of the distribution earning capital income, so think stock dividends. And this is all, these sources are all lumped together in capital income, and if you lump them all together, what you find is a very stable sort of income source over the period. So the proportion is stable, 14 to 17% over this period. It is a highly skewed distribution, but there's no clear trend in the Gini. So again, changes here will not explain that trend in the Gini that I was showing you in that graph. Okay? So this is not the story. Trends in the labor market. So a lot more action happening here. And this is where the story mostly lies, in those trends. It's coming from the labor market. So on average, labor earnings comprise 75% of total pre-tax household income, so it is the major source of income. And what was happening in the labor market over this period was a very strong tightening of the labor market. So unemployment rates fell from 10% to under 5% over this period. Earnings distributions were also shifting over this period. So what you see is a smoothly increasing dispersion in earnings over this period. This is true for all workers in total. It's also true if you look at just full-time adults as well. It's true for males and females, although the increase is sharper for males than females. And let me show you, this is a classic graph if you study inequality in earnings. So I'll just talk you briefly through it. So these are deciles in the earnings distribution in Australia. So the bottom, the first decile, so line up all the earnings levels in increasing order, divide this in two groups, bottom 10%, top 90%. This person is sitting right at the divide. So it's the first decile person. The ninth decile person, if you take the overall distribution, divide it into two, the top 10%, bottom 90%. The ninth decile is sitting right at that divide, and so on throughout the distribution. These are all anchored at 100, so we're looking at growth rates. If there had been no change in inequality, you would have one line running through this graph. But instead, what you see is a fanning out of these deciles, and that means increasing inequality in earnings. So what you see is a quite smooth increase in earnings inequality over this whole period, which is a puzzle because remember, income inequality was stable over the 90s. So one puzzle here is how could income inequality remain stable over the 90s, where you have this happening in the labor market, where the earnings inequality just keeps going up over time. So that's one puzzle. And here I've divided the graph into the two periods that I was looking at. So this is 93 to 03. This was the period of stable income inequality. You can see the increase in earnings inequality. This is the period of increase in income inequality. You see further increases in the earnings inequality happening. It's a bit hard to see, but in fact there was an acceleration of the increasing inequality in this period in earnings. So you do have some numbers here in post-GFC, and you can see a bit of the dampening in earnings inequality. Still happening, but it's not growing as fast post-GFC, especially at the top. Okay. One characteristic of earnings inequality and trends in earnings inequality over time is that it is pervasive. You see increasing earnings inequality across and within occupations, industry, for males, for females, within and across age groups. No matter how you cut the data, you're going to see an increase in earnings inequality within groups and across groups. It is very pervasive. The growth in earnings inequality accelerated in the 90s in the US and the UK, and a bit later in Australia and Canada. So, as I said before, it accelerated starting in the early 2000s in Australia. There are faster increases in earnings at the top, so that is mainly driving this increase in earnings inequality. It's happening throughout the distribution, but the really fast growth rates are happening at the top. And you do see large country differences in these trends. How have people explained these increasing numbers in terms of earnings inequality? This is an extensive area of work in economics. The dominant explanation is an increased demand for high-skilled, high-ability individuals. This, in turn, is driven by skill-biased technological change, for example, computerization of the workforce. Most economists believe this is what is really happening, although, to be fair, trying to anchor this based on hard evidence has been very difficult. So there's a well-known example of an international well-known labor economist who quite early on computed returns to the use of computers in the workplace and was showing that this was driving the earnings inequality. And not long after, the results were reproduced using pencils at work instead of computers at work. So this is an example of how difficult it has been to actually tie down these theories to hard data, hard evidence. Although most people believe this is really the right model. So this skill-biased technological change is augmented by changes in trade and globalization. So you think of increased trade being allowing substitution for low-skilled workers, and globalization as well. And again, these theories have not been supported by hard evidence. So the trade models would suggest that you would see a lot more differences across industries than you actually do. You see, the differences across industries is not very important. Most of the inequality is within the industries, not across the industries. And that goes against the predictions of standard trade models. So it has been difficult to prove these or to support these theories with hard evidence. Institutional factors are also believed to be very important here. You think of deunionization, minimum wages, and social norms. And these factors are needed mostly to explain differences across countries. So if you look at Nordic countries in Europe, you find much slower growth in inequality, even though they're going through the same skill-biased technological change and trade and globalization. And so the factor being used there is usually these institutional factors. So in Nordic countries, the wage determination has remained very centralized. Unions have remained powerful, and social norms have stayed quite against very high incomes at the top, high earnings at the top. And so that is believed to be important in keeping down the increases at the top of the distribution. Okay, I mentioned before there's this puzzle that earnings inequality was increasing rapidly over the period, but you had stable income inequality over the 90s. So it's interesting to see how you can have both those things happening. And when you go from individual earnings inequality to income inequality at the household level, lots of factors come into play. So you have to understand the employment profile within the households, across the households, relationship between partners' earnings. So here I'm referring to assortative matching. So high earnings people tend to be partnered with high earnings people as well. So if there's a change in that sort of relationship, that will affect the income inequality, but not necessarily the earnings inequality. You also have to take into account relationship between the presence number of children and the earnings of the parents. So we have tools to decompose distributions into all these individual factors that I have mentioned. Now I will spare you the details of all of the decomposition techniques, But I will show you a few salient facts in this exercise. So the question is, why did household income inequality remain stable with rapidly increasing individual earnings inequality? So if you look at the data for Australia, you can rule out changes in the sortative matching. If you look at correlations across spouses' earnings, they actually decline, which would reduce inequality, but only slightly. So nothing much happening here. If you look at the changes in the male-female wage gap, again, it was very stable over this period, so nothing's happening there. And a large part of the story, in fact, lies in changes in female employment. So let me show you a few numbers here. So here I'm looking at the rate or the proportion of households with employed males or females. So this is not the usual employment rate that we are used to seeing. So I just look at all the households and look at households that have an employed male and households that have an employed female. And the households that had an employed female went up 8% over this period. No change in households with employed male. And this increase in female, in households with employed female was very important for the distribution of income and for income inequality, because this increase in female employment happened mainly from 2 adult households with dependents, and it happened in the bottom to the middle of the income distribution. So that kept inequality in income down, and women's inequality grows slower than males' inequality. So that also kept inequality down. So that's a big part of the picture. And you can compute counterfactuals showing that keeping female employment rates at their 94 levels would have increased the Gini on household income. So then you would have seen an increase in income inequality as well as an increase in earnings inequality. So a big part of the puzzle lies with female employment. And so I've just said all that's on the slide except for the bottom line, which is that women saved the day over the 90s. I think Faye would have liked this conclusion. Okay, another interesting fact about female labor supply in Australia, some of you may know this, some of you may not, but female labor supply in Australia is lower than what you see in Europe, North America. This is true in participation, it's also true in hours of work. Whereas male labor supply is quite comparable with Europe and with North America. And the difference is found mainly for women with children, and the difference persists after the youngest child reaches school age. So there's no recovery of the female labor supply after children are in school age. And this is just be compared to Europe and North America. And a few people have looked at explaining this difference. Alison Preston and co-authors were comparing Australia to Canada, and they were arguing that the poorly developed childcare system in Australia and poorly developed parental leave system in Australia contributed to a lower female labor supply in Australia compared to Canada. Patricia Apps has worked on this, comparing labor supply in Australia mostly to European countries, and she argues that the effective marginal tax rates are higher in Australia for 2 adult households with children. So this is where the family benefit scheme means testing cuts in. It cuts in just at that part of the distribution where the responsiveness in labor supply is very high. So she argues that these rates are higher in Australia in that part of the distribution, which really matters here, compared to Europe and North America. Another related point, Mike Keane, he wrote a big survey of labor supply, the labor supply literature for the new Handbook of Labor Economics, and he argues that economists have underestimated the responsiveness to effective marginal tax rates in general. So Patricia argues the rates are higher in Australia. He argues we have underestimated how responsive labor supply is to these effective marginal tax rates. Okay? Now he argues this is true for men and women, and his argument is based on a longer term outlook. Individuals plan how to invest in human capital and experience in the labor market over longer periods of time, and if you take that into account when you look at responsiveness to effective marginal tax rates, you get much more responsive labor supply to tax rates. And so, bottom line, women could have saved the day even more. Okay, so in the later period, 03 to 08, there was slower employment growth, especially for women, and there was even a slight increase in the number of jobless households. And the number of jobless households is important for the translation of earnings inequality to income inequality. And so the employment picture was not as rosy over this period. And so what you saw is fast increasing earnings inequality and no mitigating effect coming from labor supply. And so you had an increase in income inequality.